Imagine trying to feed a city of 1 million people every single day. That's Rome at its peak.
Yo,
But
yeah.
wind the clock back further. The very first cities, like Uruk in ancient Mesopotamia, home to tens of thousands who weren't out farming. How did they keep everyone fed without supermarkets, trucks, or refrigeration? It, uh, it feels impossible from our perspective today.
It really does. But they figured it out. What's fascinating is that they developed incredibly innovative and, well, revolutionary food systems that made urban life possible in the first place.
And that's what we're exploring in this deep dive. We're going to unpack the systems that allowed the world's first great cities to rise and thrive by mastering food production, storage, and distribution.
And we've got a great stack of your sources here: academic articles, research excerpts, notes on archaeology, ancient texts like cuneiform tablets and papyri. It covers Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, classical Greece, and of course the Roman Empire.
It's a treasure trove. Our mission is to pull out the most important insights, understand the core challenges each culture faced, see the surprising ways they solved them, and figure out what feeding a city meant for their societies, for power dynamics, and, for the very foundation of urbanism. As we explore these ancient solutions, what specific detail or aha moment will stand out to you?
Well, let's begin where it all started, really, in Mesopotamia. The sources are very clear that the rise of the first cities, like Uruk, was absolutely dependent on fundamentally changing how food was produced and distributed.
So not just better farming, but a totally new system.
Exactly. The arid climate of the Tigris-Euphrates region presented a huge challenge. They couldn't just rely on rainfall. Making agriculture possible at the scale needed to feed growing populations required engineering large-scale irrigation systems. That was absolutely foundational.
And the sources highlight barley as the dominant crop there.
Yeah.
It was apparently more reliable because it's more drought-tolerant than wheat.
Correct. That reliability was key. Combined with technological advancements like the introduction of the plow and what archaeologists call the secondary products revolution, moving beyond just meat to utilize animals like sheep and goats for wool and dairy, they significantly increased overall food output.
And this created the necessary surplus to feed people who weren't farmers themselves. People living in the city, working as builders, administrators, craftspeople.
Precisely. But having the surplus isn't enough. You have to manage it. And this is where Mesopotamia gets incredibly organized very early on. Surplus grain wasn't just left to individuals. It was centrally stored and managed, primarily by the temple and palace institutions.
So the big institutions controlled the food supply. That early.
Yes. At sites like Uruk, archaeologists have found evidence of sealed storerooms within the Iana temple precinct. The seals, or crutulae, found on the door fastenings are direct proof of centralized control and accounting of goods, including grain.
And that links to the writing system too, doesn't it? The sources mention the earliest cuneiform tablets are absolutely full of administrative records.
They are. The sources describe this as a powerful redistributive economy. Instead of wages and, say, silver, workers dependent on these large institutions, laborers, builders, even administrators were compensated with standard rations. The very earliest proto-cuneiform texts from Uruk, they're dominated by these grain accounts and ration lists, showing it was a central administrative concern from the get-go.
Wow, so feeding the workers was basically the state's job, or the temple's.
Fundamentally, yes, for a significant portion of the population tied to those institutions. The sources mention the standard old Mesopotamian ration system often included barley, oil, and wool, basic necessities.
While we might picture massive government warehouses, the sources note that in Mesopotamia they're less visibly preserved archaeologically compared to later Egypt, which is interesting.
Yeah, it is. But the written records and those thousands of sealings still confirm large-scale storage happened. We just don't have the same monumental brick structures surviving everywhere.
But we do find granaries.
That's right. We also find archaeological evidence of granaries and threshing floors in both cities and surrounding fortified estate centers, clearly designed to produce and supply local populations.
Okay, they produced the surplus, they stored it centrally. But how did they make it last and make it usable? Processing and preservation must have been critical.
Absolutely. They processed cereals into more stable forms. Brewing large quantities of beer from barley was hugely important, not just a drink, but a core staple, almost interchangeable with bread. And it kept better than raw grain. Storable calories.
Ah, the famous beveled rim bowls. The sources mention these are found everywhere at Uruk sites. What's the thinking on those? Are they ration bowls?
Many scholars believe these bowls were actually used to distribute those standard grain rations, perhaps containing a specific measure of barley mush or, like, beer paste. They're a really tangible link to the daily act of being fed by the central institutions.
That makes it feel very real, almost like finding ancient Tupperware. What other preservation methods did they use?
Well, parching or drying grain before storage was common. Sealed silos and granaries helped protect against pests and moisture. In a hot climate, preserving meat and fish was harder, but they did use sun drying and salting. Staples like onions, dates, and salt would have also been important for diet and potentially preservation.
And later on, better milling tools and ovens made bread production more efficient, right? Technology improves.
Yes, exactly. And they diversified through dairy and fermentation methods as well, getting more out of their resources.
So how did all this food management directly enable urban growth? Let's connect those dots.
Think about it. Reliable harvests and this central system of distribution meant you didn't need everyone farming. Labor was freed up for other tasks, building monumental architecture, developing crafts, establishing administration, all the things that make a city a city.
So the temples and palaces provisioning this workforce was the engine driving urbanization.
It was key. It allowed Europe to grow to an unprecedented size for its time, maybe 40 to 50,000 people. The city couldn't feed itself. A well-organized rural society had to produce the surplus for the city. The sources really emphasize this symbiosis. Cities organize their hinterlands to supply the urban center.
And in times of drought or flood, that stored grain could be rationed to avert famine. That's huge. So the managed grain economy was fundamental to supporting the first true cities and to their survival through hard times.
If we connect this back to our opening thought, the challenge of feeding a city, this Mesopotamian innovation, shows that organized food production and distribution at scale wasn't just a logistical problem to be solved. It was the prerequisite for civilization as we know it to even begin. Maybe the granaries were, in a way, more important than the early walls.
That's a provocative thought. Okay, let's jump across to ancient Egypt. A completely different environment, the Nile Valley, but the same core challenge of feeding large urban populations.
And Egypt had a remarkable geographic advantage. The annual Nile flood deposited rich silt, making farming incredibly productive with much less need for complex, large-scale irrigation compared to Mesopotamia. It was, naturally fertilized every year.
So abundance was the starting point. Less struggle for the basics.
Yes, relatively speaking. Staples like wheat, specifically emmer wheat, and barley grew easily, along with flax, fruits, and vegetables. The sources highlight Egypt's ancient reputation as a granary of the ancient world because of the sheer size of their surpluses.
And state oversight was also strong here, right? Maybe even stronger.
Very strong and very centralized. The pharaoh was considered the divine owner of all land. A significant portion of the harvest was collected as tax or rent and went straight into royal or temple granaries, creating a powerful centralized stockpile that underpinned the state's power. Papyrus records, like the Wilbur Papyrus, detailed this bureaucratic management of land and grain taxes. Meticulous record-keeping.
What's fascinating is how visible and massive their state storage system was, even archaeologically. You can still see some of these structures.
It was highly organized and physically imposing. Large central granaries and urban centers and temple domains weren't just food reserves, they were effectively treasuries. Grain itself was a form of currency and value. Wealth was measured in grain.
And just like Mesopotamia, the state used grain to pay people. The ration system again.
Exactly. Workers on state projects, the builders of pyramids, soldiers, artisans, were paid in rations of bread and beer. According to Egyptologists like Hanna Vymazlova, the daily rations were typically bread and beer, supplemented by monthly grain deliveries. Meat and vegetables were more like bonuses, less frequent additions.
The Turnstrike Papyrus is such a human story that brings this to life. It describes tomb builders who actually went on strike, the first recorded strike, because they didn't receive their grain rations. It shows how directly food supply was tied to state authority and, well, daily life.
It's incredible, isn't it? And it was about bread. It perfectly illustrates the system's importance and the potential consequences when it broke down. You also see official titles like Overseer of the Granaries, which show just how vital and bureaucratic the system was. It wasn't an afterthought, it was central administration.
And the sheer capacity of these granaries enabled enormous state projects, like the pyramids.
Yes. Surpluses buffered against drought years, and grain allowed the state to mobilize and feed massive workforces. Look at the Tomb of Mekhetre model, that wooden diorama from around 1980 BCE. It's amazing.
The one showing scribes carefully accounting for grain being poured into silos.
Yes, it's such a vivid illustration. It shows the meticulous record keeping and the cultural significance. Keeping track of grain was fundamental to maintaining ma'at, the Egyptian concept of cosmic and social order. It also shows the architecture. Peaked roofs, raised mud brick silos designed specifically to protect grain from pests and moisture.
Preservation techniques were essential there too. Baking durable bread and mass brewing beer helped staples last longer.
And their arid climate was a huge advantage for grain storage in sealed silos. It could last for years, protected from moisture and pests. They also perfected drying and salting for things like Nile fish, and used sealed storage jars and natural preservatives like honey or oil.
Archaeological finds back this up. Ventilated granaries, large ovens, brewery installations, grinding querns. And that Mekhetre bakery model shows specialized, potentially mass production, like little food factories.
The ability to preserve and mass-produce staples, minimize spoilage, and ensured a consistent food supply for urban centers like Thebes or Memphis.
And this system supported those cities, which grew to tens of thousands, all fed by the countryside's grain managed by the state.
The food security in Egypt during stable periods was remarkable, with relatively few records of severe urban starvation compared to other places. Centralized rationing mobilized labor for massive projects like the pyramids. We know the Giza pyramid workers received relatively generous rations, and Egypt was initially self-sufficient, but later became such a powerhouse producer it became a major grain exporter, feeding cities like Rome.
So the Nile's bounty, combined with the pharaoh's granary system, created this powerful cycle of growth and stability, where control over food reinforced their authority as the guarantor of prosperity and order.
Precisely. Control over food was control over the population, over labor, over everything. Even legends like Djoser's famine Stilla show the expectation that authorities would open the granaries during times of scarcity. It was part of the deal.
Okay, shifting gears again to the Indus Valley civilization, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. This feels different because their writing hasn't been deciphered yet. A real challenge for us.
It does create more mystery. We rely much more heavily on the physical evidence from archaeology to piece together their story. But their cities show incredibly sophisticated urban planning, and that planning clearly incorporated their food economy in some way.
What did their farming look like? What were they eating?
It was diverse. The sources describe staples like wheat and six-row barley, plus pulses like lentils and chickpeas. Sesame for oil, cotton, and even rice seems to appear in later phases. Domesticated animals included cattle, which seem especially important, likely for draft power and food water, buffalo, goats, sheep, and chickens. They also ate a lot of fish from the Indus River.
Stable isotope analysis, that's the technique where they study ancient bones, confirms they had a very varied diet.
Yeah.
That diversity would have been a great buffer against single crop failures, wouldn't it?
Yes, a kind of built-in resilience. Their agriculture was aided by the seasonal Indus rivers and maybe localized irrigation like wells or flood recession farming. And the fact that cities like Mohenjo-Daro grew to around 40,000 people suggests they had a consistent food supply, supporting a non-farming population involved in complex crafts and extensive trade.
Let's talk about those iconic massive brick structures at Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, the so-called granaries. They look
Yeah.
like they could be exactly that.
They are certainly substantial public buildings. At Mohenjo-Daro, there's the Great Granary, a huge brick structure, about 50 by 27 meters, built on platforms with partitioned rooms. At Harappa, there's a similar large complex made of rows of brick foundations. They have features that would be great for storage, thick floors, raised profiles to protect against floods, and even evidence of air channels underneath, almost anticipating later Roman granaries for ventilation.
But this is where the sources reveal a really interesting debate, right?
Yeah.
Recent scholarship questions if these were only used for grain storage. It's not a slam dunk.
That's one of the big mysteries. The lack of significant charred grain deposits, identifiable storage bins, or lots of administrative ceilings inside these specific structures is puzzling. It has led some scholars to propose they might have served other public functions, perhaps assembly halls, treasuries, or marketplaces for bulk goods.
Okay, so maybe not solely granaries, but clearly significant public buildings related to managing communal resources or activities on a large scale. Part of the planned infrastructure.
Exactly, they were part of a planned system. And other evidence does point to a managed food economy. Those distinctive standardized cubical stone weights found across the region were likely used for regulated trade or taxation of commodities, possibly including sacks of grain. Granary-like buildings are found in the citadel area, the administrative sector, which hints at collection or redistribution, and clay ceilings, used to mark goods, imply things were tracked.
The sources also mention something notable about the Indus compared to Mesopotamia or Egypt: the absence of clear evidence for kings or temples explicitly monopolizing the food supply. No giant palaces or overwhelming temple complexes like in the other regions.
That's a key difference, and it's really intriguing. It suggests a potentially less centralized system of management. Perhaps it involved community groups, merchant guilds, or local administrators, what some scholars call a hierarchical system, where power isn't just concentrated pyramid style at the very top. Maybe ensuring broad food security was more of a shared responsibility or part of the social contract that held their society together.
At Harappa, those circular brick platforms near the granary site, what were those used for? They sound specific.
The interpretation is that they were processing areas, possibly for pounding or husking grain, as one actually contained the remains of a large wooden mortar. This suggests large-scale food processing happening right near where resources might have been stored or distributed. And seals depicting figures with scales or offering stands could be symbolic references to regulated food trade in markets, though it's hard to be certain without readable text.
For preservation, what methods did the Indus people likely use, similar to the others?
Probably similar principles. Storage in large pottery vessels in cool, dark rooms was likely common. Those elevated building foundations help keep contents dry and safe from floods and pests. They likely parched grain and perhaps used chaff-lined storage pits. Dried fish found far inland implies they used salting or sun-drying for transport. Meat was probably preserved similarly, maybe using spices.
Brewing is also suggested by analysis of pottery vessels. People always seem to figure out beer.
Yes, residue analysis is ongoing, but it's plausible they brewed grain products. They had sophisticated pottery, brick hearths, tandoor-like ovens, and grinding tools for processing food. Oils like sesame were definitely used for diet and possibly preservation, and their extensive trade network, reaching Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf, implies they needed ways to preserve traded foodstuffs for long journeys.
And their famous urban sanitation, the drains and wells that would have indirectly helped keep food healthier by managing waste and pests, right? A clean city is better for food storage.
It was a truly integrated approach, blending preservation techniques, solid basic technologies, standardization evident in weights and even brick sizes, and that sophisticated urban planning to support their population.
So the Indus represents a fascinating alternative model: highly organized urban infrastructure, but possibly less centralized control over food than their neighbors, maybe relying more on a network of trade and local management. It's a puzzle we're still piecing together, largely because of that undeciphered script.
And this raises an important question. Did this more distributed approach make them more resilient in some ways? Or potentially more vulnerable to certain kinds of disruption, like environmental change, in the long run? It's something that archaeological evidence still leads us to debate. The reasons for their decline are complex and still discussed.
Let's shift gears again, heading west to ancient Greece, specifically focusing on Athens during the classical period. Their challenge was fundamentally different due to geography. Very mountainous, not great for large-scale grain farming.
Absolutely. The Greek mainland, particularly Attica, where Athens is located, has limited arable land compared to the river valleys we've discussed. It's great for olives, grapevines, and figs, but it simply couldn't produce enough grain to feed a large city like Athens, which grew to perhaps 150,000 or more people at its height.
So self-sufficiency, like early Egypt, wasn't an option. They were forced into a mixed economy from fairly early on. Local produce plus imports.
Yes. Local production of oil, wine, some grains, and animal products from pastoralism was vital, but it had to be supplemented by massive grain imports, especially wheat. The sources explicitly state Athens fed itself chiefly on grain imported from South Russia, the Black Sea region, Sicily, and Egypt. They were dependent on the sea lanes.
That implies an enormous sustained trade operation. A lifeline.
It was monumental for the time. Demosthenes, the orator, mentions up to 400 shiploads of grain coming to Athens yearly. Their port, Piraeus, had to be a major logistical hub with extensive storage facilities and warehouses. Archaeological finds, like huge numbers of large transport amphorae designed for grain or wine, confirm this scale.
And the Athenian government got heavily involved to secure this supply, didn't it? It wasn't just laissez-faire trade.
No, food supply was far too important. It was a matter of state security. They established diplomatic ties and even military alliances with grain-producing regions like the colonies around the Black Sea. They had laws against Athenian merchants exporting grain away from Athens during shortages, and special officials called xenophilics, literally grain guardians, monitored the market in the agora to prevent hoarding and price gouging.
But unlike Rome later, there wasn't a permanent free dole system, no automatic handout.
No, the system relied primarily on market mechanisms. Citizens bought bread or grain in the agora, facing prices that could fluctuate based on supply and demand, harvests abroad, and the safety of the Celians. Subsidized or free distribution only happened occasionally during severe crises, often funded by wealthy citizens performing liturgies or by the state treasury, but it wasn't a regular entitlement for a large portion of the population.
Salted fish was also a really important protein import for the non-elite, coming from places as far as the Black Sea and Spain, right? Adding protein to a grain-heavy diet.
It filled a crucial dietary gap. Athens' urban survival was completely tied to its naval power and its maritime trade network. It's one of the earliest major examples of a city essentially globalizing its food sources to feed its population, relying on distant regions for its staple food.
Within the city itself, what was the infrastructure for managing all this incoming food? Where did it go?
In the agora, the central marketplace, there were specific covered colonnades or stoas and possibly dedicated granaries for grain sale and storage. Emergency grain supplies were apparently kept in the tholos around public building. And the main public granaries for holding the bulk of imported cereal were down at the port of Piraeus.
I imagine preserving food for transport over long sea voyages and for storage was crucial, maybe even more so than in places with local supply.
Absolutely. Methods included drying and smoking fish and meats. Pickling in brine was common for fish and olives, in fact. This Greek practice was likely a precursor to the famous Roman fish sauce, garum. Wine and olive oil production, of course, created durable transportable goods. And rusks, or hardtack, double-baked bread, were standard for storage, used by sailors, armies, and likely city dwellers as a long-lasting bread source.
Technology improved too, like rotary mills eventually replacing saddle querns.
Yes, by the Hellenistic period, hand-operated rotary mills, which were much more efficient than the old back-and-forth grinding stones, became more common. They also used cool storage methods, like underground silos or storing wine and oil in large ceramic jars called pithoi, often buried partly underground.
And because seafaring was dangerous or impossible in winter, they had to stockpile enough grain each year during the sailing season to last through those months when imports stopped.
Exactly. Planning was essential. Prices and availability were constant public concerns. Despite the challenges and the reliance on distant, sometimes unstable sources, Athens rarely suffered truly devastating famines during its golden age, which speaks to the overall effectiveness of their combined market and regulatory system, at least when their naval power could protect the trade routes.
And this links directly to politics, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Food wasn't just economics, it was high politics.
Completely. Access to affordable grain was a fundamental issue of public order. Shortages could easily cause riots and political instability. Politicians often gained popularity by promising to secure the grain supply or even offering subsidies. The vulnerability of their supply could even decide wars. Athens' final surrender in the long Peloponnesian War in 404 BCE was ultimately due to a Spartan blockade cutting off their grain imports through the Hellespont. Starvation forced their hand.
Wow. And later, Hellenistic kings sometimes sent gifts of grain as a political gesture to win favor. And Athenian democracy itself partly rested on ensuring citizens had some level of economic stability, which meant keeping grain prices reasonably affordable.
It's a very different model compared to the more centralized systems of the East. The Greek cities, especially Athens, relied heavily on private trade and individual merchant initiative, with state intervention primarily focused on regulation, diplomacy, and emergency measures. This market-based model worked well when Athens controlled the seas, but they were extremely vulnerable to disruptions in trade or naval defeat.
So Athens represents a kind of transitional model sustained by commerce, maritime power, and early forms of market regulation, maybe laying the groundwork for something even bigger, even more complex.
Which brings us inevitably to Rome.
Imperial Rome. A metropolis of maybe 1 million people at its peak. The sources make it crystal clear. Feeding this population daily was arguably the single greatest administrative and logistical challenge of the entire ancient world. Italy simply couldn't produce enough food for its capital city after a certain point.
The Roman answer was to systematically turn the entire empire into Rome's breadbasket. Provinces like Egypt, already a granary, and North Africa, what they called Africa proconsularis, Sicily, later Spain, and even the Black Sea region became dedicated suppliers, their agricultural output geared towards feeding the capital.
The scale is truly mind-boggling. Estimates suggest Rome needed somewhere between 200,000 to 400,000 tons of grain per year. That required hundreds of massive cargo ships constantly arriving year after year.
The state harnessed the empire's resources to make this happen. Provincial taxes were often collected directly in grain, not just coin. Vast agricultural estates, sometimes owned by the emperor or senators, were created and operated specifically to produce surplus food for export back to Rome.
And the logistics involved were incredible, massive state-built granaries in port cities across the Mediterranean, dedicated grain fleets like the famed one sailing from Alexandria, and huge harbor infrastructure projects like Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber and the later, larger artificial harbor at Portus.
The story of Emperor Claudius building Portus is a great illustration of how critical this was. According to the historian Suetonius, after a grain shortage caused a near riot in Rome, where people actually threw crusts of bread at the emperor himself, Claudius personally supervised the construction of this huge, safer harbor complex to ensure a safe winter unloading. It shows how vital food supply was to maintaining public order and imperial authority.
Once the grain reached Italy, it was barged up the Tiber River to Rome's city granaries. But the defining feature of Rome's system, unlike any before it on this scale, was the annona, the grain dole.
The annona was the institutionalized, state-sponsored food dole. It evolved from politicians offering subsidized grain in the late Republic, like Gaius Gracchus, to completely free monthly distributions initiated by figures like Clodius Pulcher, eventually stabilized by the emperors to benefit around 150,000 to 200,000 registered male citizens.
So about one-fifth of the city's estimated population was receiving free grain every month. That's a massive welfare program.
Yes, an amount often standardized at about 5 modi, which is roughly 33 kilograms or 73 pounds per person per month, enough for basic bread for a family. It was a crucial tool for social stability. The famous phrase, bread in circuses, wasn't just cynicism. Ensuring the urban masses were fed was fundamental to keeping them content and preventing unrest. Emperors like Augustus publicly boasted about their role in securing the grain supply and making generous distributions.
And it expanded over time beyond just grain.
It did. Septimius Severus, in the early 3rd century CE, added olive oil to the dole. And later, Emperor Aurelian, in the 270s CE, reportedly added rations of pork and wine, creating a more comprehensive food basket for the urban poor receiving the annona.
This must have required a huge bureaucracy to manage it all.
Enormous. From provincial procurators overseeing the collection of grain as tax, to the specialized shippers, to the herari or warehouse managers in Rome and Ostia, all coordinated by a very high-ranking official, the prefect of the annona in Rome. Archaeological evidence of this system is still dramatically visible today, the remains of vast public granaries, the Heraea. The Heraea Galbae in Rome, for example, was a massive complex that could store maybe 20 to 30,000 tons of grain, built with raised floors for ventilation. You can still see many large Heraea at Ostia.
And Monte Tassio, that artificial hill made entirely of broken pottery shards.
It's a stunning physical testament to the sheer scale of Roman imports. It's essentially a landfill, maybe 50 meters high, built up over centuries from an estimated 50 to 80 million broken amphorae, mostly the large globular jars used for shipping Spanish and North African olive oil, offloaded as part of the annona supply chain. It literally shows you the staggering volume of food commodities moving into the city.
It's important to remember, though, this wasn't the only way Romans got food, right? It wasn't a completely socialist state.
Absolutely not. It was a dual system. The state dole, the annona, provided a safety net, primarily grain and later oil, for about 20% of the population. The rest of the population and wealthier citizens wanting variety bought food from private markets and bakeries. We find remains of numerous commercial bakeries like those preserved in Pompeii, complete with large mills often powered by donkeys. But the annona undoubtedly helped stabilize the overall price and availability of staple foods for everyone in the city.
This complex, comprehensive approach, state intervention plus market, is what allowed Rome's population to swell to perhaps 1 million people, far beyond any local agricultural capacity.
Technology and preservation were also refined to support this system. They built on earlier knowledge, improving ship technology. The large Alexandrian grain ships, the corbitas, could carry over 300 tons, and mastering port engineering.
And preservation methods. They must have been experts.
They were. Drying grain to low moisture levels was standard practice. They likely used fumigation. The warehouse design emphasized coolness and dryness. Amphorae sealed with pitch were used extensively for transporting liquids like wine and oil, but possibly some grains too over long sea distances.
And they became masters of salting and pickling, building on Greek methods.
Yes. The famous garum, that pungent fermented fish sauce, was produced almost industrially in factories in places like Spain and Gaul and shipped in vast quantities to Rome. Salted and smoked meats, like Gallic ham, were also common imports. They dried fruits like figs and raisins, stored them in honey, and the wealthy even had access to cool cellars or possibly even snow pits for rudimentary refrigeration.
And for processing the grain itself, mills got bigger and better.
Definitely. They adopted and significantly improved the rotary quern from the Hellenistic world. They built large mills powered by animals like donkeys, which you can see very clearly in the Pompeii bakeries. Later, especially from the late Roman period, they applied water power on an impressive scale, like the famous Barbagal Mill complex in southern Gaul, which had multiple overshot water wheels driving mills almost an ancient factory. Mills were also built along the Tiber in Rome itself.
The government even got involved in bread quality, and by Emperor Aurelian's time, there's evidence they might have shifted from distributing grain to distributing ready-baked loaves daily from state bakeries, showing incredibly advanced state processing and logistics.
This integration of preservation, engineering, transport, and administration created a remarkably resilient food supply system that sustained Rome for centuries, though it wasn't perfect. Shortages and famines did occur, often linked to political instability, piracy, or warfare disrupting the supply lines, hence Claudius getting pelted with bread crusts.
The belly has no ears. That phrase seems to capture the fundamental Roman understanding that a well-fed population was key to peace and imperial stability. The Annona wasn't charity. It was fundamentally social and political policy.
Its importance was even reflected culturally and ideologically. The goddess Annona, personifying the grain supply, frequently appeared on coins and public monuments, often holding a cornucopia or grain measures. Control of the grain supply could literally make or break an emperor during civil wars. Securing or disrupting Rome's food was a strategic goal. It also drove economic specialization in the provinces, sometimes forcing entire regions into monoculture grain farming primarily to feed Rome.
Rome's cityscape, with its vast granaries and that mountain of amphora shards, Monte Testaccio, was a physical manifestation of its dependence on distant lands. The daily reality for many Romans was either lining up for the dole or buying bread from the bakeries.
Rome's system was arguably the peak of ancient urban food management, a complex interprovincial machine combining elements of a market economy with massive, sustained state intervention. It was the engine that underpinned their grandeur and supported a population size previously unimaginable. And, conversely, its decline was deeply intertwined with the shrinking of the empire and the loss of control over those vital supply lines from Africa and Egypt.
Looking across all these civilizations now, from Uruk all the way to Rome, what are the common threads? What fundamental principles did they all seem to figure out, maybe independently?
Well, first and foremost, they all understood that to have a city, a concentration of non-food producers, you absolutely needed a reliable agricultural surplus, especially storable cereals like barley or wheat. That's the bedrock.
And they all recognized the absolute necessity of centralized storage, whether it was in temples, palaces, maybe those Indus public buildings, or formal state granaries. You needed facilities to accumulate that surplus, manage it, and buffer against inevitable shortages or bad harvests.
Administrative records were consistently crucial across all these literate cultures for measuring, recording, and controlling the flow of food. Writing itself may have partly developed in response to this need in Mesopotamia. You need to keep track.
And some form of ration or redistribution system seems almost universal, connecting the urban population to the ruling institutions, whether it was Mesopotamian temple rations, Egyptian state wages in bread and beer, Athenian market guardians, or the formal Roman state dole. It tied people to the system.
They also shared a basic toolkit of food production and processing technology: plows, sickles, grinding stones, ovens, which obviously evolved and improved significantly over time. And fundamental preservation methods like drying, smoking, salting, and fermenting seem to have been discovered or refined independently across these regions out of sheer necessity, practical knowledge shared or rediscovered.
So was it just a coincidence that across all these vastly different cultures and time periods, the ability to feed your people was so directly linked to political stability and the legitimacy of rulers? Or is that fundamental?
I think the sources suggest it's fundamental. That connection seems universal. Rulers across these eras, whether priests, kings, assemblies, or emperors, understood implicitly or explicitly that ensuring a stable food supply was paramount. Full granaries were a tangible sign of good governance, of prosperity, of power. Failure meant unrest, loss of legitimacy, maybe even
But
collapse.
their approaches certainly differed, didn't they? Reflecting geography, social organization, their specific history.
Definitely. We see a whole spectrum of centralization. You have the highly centralized state or temple control in early Mesopotamia, and especially Egypt. Then the Indus Valley seems potentially more decentralized, maybe more community or merchant-led, though we're less certain. Classical Greece, particularly Athens, relied heavily on private trade, albeit with significant state regulation and intervention. And then Rome kind of circled back to massive imperial state control via the Annona, operating alongside a large private market. It's not a simple linear progression.
And the role of long-distance trade varied hugely. Egypt was initially self-sufficient and became an exporter. Athens and Rome became utterly dependent on massive maritime imports for their very survival. Mesopotamia and the Indus seem more regionally focused in their staple food supply, though they engaged in long-distance trade for other goods.
Infrastructure designs varied too. Think of the tall Egyptian silos versus the warehouse-like Mesopotamian magazines or Roman Haria or those debated Indus platforms. And of course, the sheer scale of these systems grew dramatically over time, mirroring the exponential growth in urban populations, culminating in Rome.
Our understanding is also shaped by the kinds of records they left or didn't leave. The incredibly rich textual sources from Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and Rome allow for deep insights and even anecdotal stories that bring the systems to life, whereas the undeciphered Indus script leaves us relying much more heavily on archaeological interpretation, which is inherently more ambiguous sometimes.
And it's crucial to remember these weren't static systems, they evolved constantly. From perhaps purely ration-based economies in the very earliest cities to mixed systems incorporating markets, changing wage structures, and shifting balances between private enterprise and state distribution over centuries, they adapted, innovated, and sometimes failed.
So, pulling it all together, what does this deep dive into ancient urban food systems tell us about the bigger picture? What's the main takeaway?
I think it makes it incredibly clear that the story of early urbanization is fundamentally the story of organizing food. Producing that surplus and figuring out how to manage and distribute it freed people to live together in large numbers, enabling specialization, complexity, and everything else that followed. It's the invisible foundation.
Each civilization with its own unique cultural flavor, whether it's Mesopotamian scribes meticulously tracking barley, Egyptian pharaohs overseeing monumental silos, Indus planners laying out sophisticated infrastructure, Athenian merchants navigating the Black Sea, or Roman logistics experts managing the Annona. They all solved the fundamental problems of how to produce, store, distribute, and preserve food on a grand scale appropriate to their time and place.
And this ability to ensure a relatively stable supply wasn't just about basic survival. It enabled the large populations needed for complex social hierarchies, monumental architecture, standing armies, and sophisticated crafts. When those systems faltered, for whatever reason, environmental change, warfare, political collapse, cities often suffered dramatic consequences or even declined entirely.
So a powerful lesson from antiquity seems to be that investment in agricultural infrastructure, storage technology, transportation networks, and systems for equitable distribution were just as crucial to a city's long-term success and resilience as its defensive walls or its armies, maybe even more so.
Ancient urbanites lived with an acute awareness of their dependence on harvests and distribution networks, a vulnerability we might sometimes forget amidst the apparent abundance of our modern supermarkets and complex global supply chains. But the fundamental challenges of feeding dense populations reliably and equitably remain strikingly relevant, even if the technologies have changed.
To wrap up this deep dive, maybe something for you, the listener, to think about. From the simple mass-produced beveled rim bowls, possibly used for rations in Urga thousands of years ago, to Rome's incredibly complex, empire-spanning, bureaucratic Annona feeding hundreds of thousands, these ingenious ancient food systems weren't just about keeping people alive. They were the fundamental engines that powered human societies to dream bigger, build grander, and create the complex urban world we still inhabit today.
These diverse systems, despite all their differences, really underline a shared human heritage. The city, as a form of social organization, was, and arguably remains, possible only because of our collective ability to organize the production, movement, storage, and sharing of food on a grand scale. That organizational capacity is civilization in many ways.
We've explored how different ancient cultures tackled that monumental task of feeding large urban populations, each with unique solutions built on those core principles of surplus, storage, and distribution.
Think about the sheer scale of their achievements, moving mountains of grain across seas and empires, building vast storehouses without modern materials, managing complex distributions using simple tally systems or early writing, all relying primarily on human and animal power, ingenuity, and intricate organization. What aspect of these ancient food systems felt most surprising or impressive to you as you listened?
It truly makes you consider the hidden foundations of our own modern cities and how these ancient challenges of urban resilience, food security, and the politics of who gets to eat are, in many fundamental ways, still very much with us today.